Hey Stella, how are ya?
I'm good.
Good. We just recorded an episode of the Keto Diet podcast. I'm chatting all about getting your pre-baby body back and a bunch of other things. And I wanted to delve deep into your keto pregnancy slash not keto pregnancy and kind of what that transition was for you because you were eating keto before pregnant and then dot 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 what happened?
And then all of the nausea and food aversions and the keto plan kind of went out the window. So that was definitely part of it. And then also just looking into the research, just, from where the research stands now, some levels of carbohydrates are sort of important for fetal development. And so kind of making that personal decision. And I want to stress that it's a personal decision because I decided that there are plenty of people that do keto during pregnancy and everything is fine. So it's just deciding what's best for you, your body, and how you're feeling. And I approached it more of like a low carb approach. The first trimester was hard. I would say the first trimester was probably more high carb because it was what can I eat without being sick? And there was a lot of like gluten-free bagels that took place. But that was the only thing I could stomach. But then your aversions do go down. So if you are pregnant and you're thinking, I'll never be able to eat like meat and avocados again, trust me, it'll go down, I promise. And then you can make choices that are more in line with the foods that you like to eat. And then just still keeping it within like a low carb range, according to that Lily Nichols book that we talked about, is anywhere from 50 grams to 100 grams of carbohydrates per day. So it's not the 220 that they're prescribing when you get those books at the hospital, but it's definitely not the 25-30 where people are mostly doing for the ketogenic diet.
How do you have a doctor that understands that you've taken this approach? Because I know a bunch of women say, like, I told my doctor I was only eating 100 grams of carbs or 80 grams of carbs, and they were like, stop doing what you're doing. Have you dealt with that?
Yeah, so I kind of was sneaky about it. And I was like, I'm eating in the way someone with gestational diabetes would eat. And they're like, oh, okay. Because if you look, anyways, in Canada, if you look at the gestational diabetes diet, it's still like, maybe like the 150 grams of carbs per day, which there are some days where I'm at one, it depends how I'm feeling that day. But it is a lower carbohydrate diet. I think the second you say the word keto, especially because gestational diabetes is such a big thing and they're all worried about like ketoacidosis and don't realize that difference, they just panic and say, no, not keto when you're pregnant, which was the first thing. Because when I went to see my doctor for the first time and I said, oh, I'm eating keto, he was like, don't do that when you're pregnant, like terrified. So definitely it's hard to make choices when you have a medical professional saying that to you. But then you just have, for me anyways, it was just like, I know what I feel good in. I know when my body feels at its best, and a low carb range was great for me. I did not end up with gestational diabetes. I was able to avoid that, and I had a high risk for it because we have a lot of diabetes in our family. And a lot of gestational diabetes too in our family, and I was able to avoid that. And I think eating low carb throughout my pregnancy would likely was helpful in that. And babies was doing fine, and I'm doing fine. So there really had been no issues as a result of me eating a little bit less carbs than what's recommended.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what sort of carbs are you eating?
Yeah, so it's more like going back to my paleo roots. So definitely like, fruits, not really worrying too much about how many vegetables I'm eating. Although even when I was keto, I love my veggies. So I probably didn't worry too much about that. But allowing some like, higher starch vegetables, some like, sometimes I'll have some like cold white rice, but that's pretty rare. Or some, potatoes, like allowing myself to incorporate that in my diet. But like if I'll have potatoes. So for example, this morning, I tell you my breakfast, I had like half a cup of potatoes, 2 fried eggs, a little bit of berries, and a piece of ham. And all of that is pretty keto except for the potatoes. And that's probably maybe 20 grams of carbs in that meal. And you do that 3 times a day. So you're eating low carb-ish, but I'm still giving my baby all the nutrients that it needs without having to add pasta or like all of this bread or the 7 to 8 grains that they recommend.
I see. Okay, cool. Um, and you mentioned just a little bit ago how many carbs you eat depends on how you're feeling. Can you put that into like more words like when I'm feeling blah, blah, blah. I notice that if I eat more carbs, I feel this way.
Yeah, so sometimes it'll just be pure craving. Like I'll make myself a more like, either keto friendly or a low carb meal, and it just will not be satisfying, and I'll be like, I just want a green apple after, and I'll just have the green apple. So I'm not limiting myself. So sometimes it's really depending on what I'm craving to feel satisfied. And sometimes, like, I'm so used to being keto that I think inadvertently there are definitely days that I'm eating keto, and I just won't feel so good in my body. I'll feel a little bit shaky. I'll feel a little bit like lethargic, and I'll think maybe I need to do just a little bit more carbs. And I try to add my carbs, like kind of like one of the profiles in your book, Leanne. I try to add them mostly at night.
Mm.
I think that's like the fat fuel profile. So I'll just like add a little bit more carbs at night, and I'll just feel better after that, or the next day, or that headache will go away, or I'll be less shaky. And that to me, I'll be like, okay, I just needed a little bit more carbohydrates. I probably went a little too like low carb keto that day, and my body's not used to it anymore because I haven't been keto in the last 9 months.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. That's so helpful. And I know so many people will benefit from what you just shared. So thanks again for sharing your wisdom with our patrons. This is great.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course.